Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. 46 days after the Yang di-Pertuan Agong acquiesced to the Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin's request to declare a state of emergency and Parliament was suspended, His Majesty on Wednesday has now issued a clarification that the House can in fact convene. The decision on a date for this has yet to be announced, but Parliament was initially scheduled to sit from March 8th to April 8th, and this was before the state of emergency was announced last month. What can we expect to happen now? We're going to be asking our three guests precisely that question, starting with Fahmi Fadzil. He's the MP of Lembah Pantai and PKR Communications Director. Fahmi, good evening. Now that the Agong has issued the statement that the state of emergency does not prevent legislature from sitting, what will the parliamentary opposition do?
Yeah, first and foremost, of course, it's all of the issues that we've been talking about, whether it's about standard operating procedures or it's about 150,000 laptops that were promised to students or about various goings on with the government. Of course, some people may suggest certain other measures, particularly with regards to the question of legitimacy of the administration. But I think for many of us, the most important business of the day is how the government is working to uplift the economy, restart the economy, as well as to deal with COVID-19.
Fahmi, do you expect that the Prime Minister will convene Parliament this March? Because there seems to be some ambiguity in the statement coming from the Palace, suggesting that the Agong will only do so on the advice of the Prime Minister. Do you expect that he will?
I think he's in between a rock and a hard place. Because if you remember his in his speech, Tan Sri Muhyiddin's speech on the 12th of January, I think it was, one of the things that he said was that Parliament and state assemblies are not able to be convened. And yet now, 46 days later, the Sovereign has issued a statement saying that it indeed can, and those who say it can't are mistaken. So I think the signal is very clear. The onus is on the Prime Minister to advise the King to convene Parliament. Although some people say, even though the Article 14 sub 1B of the emergency ordinance does not make mention of the Prime Minister needing to advise the King. If you read that together with Article 40 of the Federal Constitution, it says on the issue of advice of Cabinet, there is some room for that. Plus, since His Majesty has issued a statement through the Royal Controller that he is waiting for the Prime Minister's advice, evidently the ball now is in Tan Sri Muhyiddin's court.
Fahmi, can I ask you about Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim's legal challenge over the emergency? I think it was exactly a month ago on January 26th that Anwar initiated a filing of this judicial review application in saying that the advice to the Yang di-Pertuan Agong to suspend Parliament sittings during an emergency period was in fact unconstitutional and against the law. What's happened to that judicial review application?
Yeah, actually, we've not been updated on the latest situation with that court case. I think the next sebutan or the next court mention is sometime in March. Of course, with a lot of court cases, this will take some time. So I don't know whether we will necessarily get to the end of the hearing and hear a decision before we actually reconvene Parliament, for example, and whether, because the Special Independent Committee on the emergency sits almost, I think, every week. At least they've met once a week for the last 2 weeks. I don't know whether they will also give independent advice to His Majesty to end the emergency sooner than August 1st, right. Sooner than the end of the proclamation of the emergency. So I don't know what the insulated.
If because the reconvening of Parliament might be an existential threat to the administration, do you think that in the event, what will happen in the event that the administration does not, in fact, convene Parliament?
Yeah, I think then it sends a very, very wrong signal, because you could read the statement from Istana Negara as it has proverbially drawn a line in the sand, so to speak, that the onus is on the Prime Minister. But at the same time, I'm also aware that the proclamation of emergency as well as the emergency ordinance, when Parliament convenes, these would have to be tabled and passed in Parliament. So I think this is probably what complicates the matters for the Prime Minister.
Fahmi, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We appreciate your time. We now have Philip Koh on the line. He's an advocate and solicitor of the High Court of Malaya. Philip, good evening. Now, you've written an opinion piece interpreting the latest developments of the Agong's clarification that the House can, in fact, convene during emergency rule. What I understand from your piece is that nothing about Parliament can be done without the express consent of Parliament. Is that a correct understanding of what you wrote?
Not quite. In an emergency, what we have is that the Article 150 provides that the proclamation and the ordinances shall be laid before Parliament. In that sense, there is a mandatory provision that it is anticipated by the framers of the Federal Constitution. An emergency proclamation has a duration that should not be unduly prolonged. Interesting for us is that our proclamation of emergency on the 11th January has a terminus date of August the 1st. And now the Royal House, His Majesty, has issued a statement on the 24th of February, which is an extremely interesting statement insofar that for many jurists who imagine that the sovereign or His Majesty has a very minor role to play in constitutional matters, the statement of the Istana affirms the supremacy of the Constitution, keluruhan perlembagaan, His Majesty states, and that he expects all the branches of the government, and he names them, the executive. He does not consider that the exclusive arm of the government. He names the kehakiman, judiciary, and then he speaks about the legislature, the parliament. So what we have is His Majesty has enjoined and affirmed a principle that Parliament nevertheless has a role to play. However, his statement is bracketed by his recognition that the Constitution itself has provided, as Fahmi has said very well, under Article 40, that the Yang di-Pertuan Agong shall act in accordance with the advice of the Cabinet or with the minister authorized, which is normally Yang Amat Mohamad, Prime Minister himself. So what we have is an interesting advisory statement by the Istana, worth reflecting upon.
Philip, do you think there was ambiguity in the initial emergency declaration? You yourself have written about the unusual termination date that is present in the declaration, something you say hasn't occurred before, and also one which suggests that Parliament does not have the role of both approving and ending a state of emergency, which is part of our history. Could you help us understand the initial declaration and whether there was an ambiguity in it?
Well, no. I do not think there is an ambiguity in the proclamation. What is novel about the proclamation is that for the first time, there is a terminus date, 1st August. For 6 months, Yang Amat Mohamad, Prime Minister, in his explanatory announcement accompanying the proclamation and the passage of the ordinance, has highlighted that there is the 1st August date. And this is gazetted under the PUA 7/2021. So it is law that this proclamation. But make no bones about it. Under Article 150, the executive could also issue another proclamation, which will extend the date. So it is not as if it were bound only by this date, but obviously the objective circumstances, which is tied to the nexus of COVID-19, has to be demonstrably a threat to security, economic life, and or public order. And throughout the statements of the Istana, both in January, especially in January, the focus was on economic life, that the COVID-19. There was no reference to national security or public order. So the only rubric that is justifiable to continue or to issue another proclamation beyond August the 1st. However, we have also noted that His Majesty has advised that there's no reason why Parliament should not sit. And Section 14 of the ordinance has an interesting phrase, that Parliament shall be summoned, prorogued, or dissolved on a date as the Yang di-Pertuan Agong thinks appropriate. It rests upon the Yang di-Pertuan Agong and a phrase that he can exercise a thought that is appropriate, fikiran, right? That's the word used in the Istana statement, but subject to the nasihat Yang Amat Berhormat Prime Minister, which is His Majesty recognition of the operational effectiveness of Article 40.
Philip, could I get you to clarify that? Because you talked about the Agong's affirmation as an advisory statement, right? But we also have Tan Sri Tengku Razali, who says, or Kuli as is better known as, that Agong actually doesn't need advice from the Prime Minister on this appropriate date for Parliament to convene again. Where do you stand on this?
That is a controversial issue. Can the Yang di-Pertuan Agong summon Parliament on his own accord without the advice of the Cabinet through the Prime Minister? The textual evidence within the Federal Constitution suggests that all the actions of the Yang di-Pertuan Agong in the exercise of his functions under the Constitution, he shall act in accordance with the advice. So it is not envisaged, at least textually, in the Article 40, that His Majesty could act unilaterally. In fact, in the 24th February statement, His Majesty affirms that he can think appropriately whether it should be called. And there is a hint that it could and ought to be called earlier and not wait beyond August the 1st. All right? But he did preface it in recognition to what he recognized as keluhuran kelembagaan, the supremacy of Constitution. He should abide with himself, his royal personage, that it must be upon the nasihat of YAB Perdana Menteri. Now, obviously, constitutional lawyers will be contesting this in the court, and I think we should await the apex court decision on this.
Philip, there seems to be perhaps a double pull or a pull in opposite directions for a lot of us, ordinary folk, as it were. On one hand, people who do not believe that the suspension of Parliament is necessary to deal with the COVID situation, and they would like to see a return to parliamentary democracy in its fullest sense. But on the other hand, the implications of having the monarch go against, as it were, or extend himself in a way that might go against the conventions of a constitutional monarchy, meaning that he takes prerogatives or decisions that are beyond what he would otherwise be allowed to do. I mean, how do we sort this out in terms of us as observers and citizens watching this unfold?
The conversation, I think, takes place in the intersection between law and political understanding. Constitutionalism recognizes that the sovereign will of a modern nation state is embedded through the elected assembly gathered under the lower house, the Dewan Rakyat, or the House of Commons in Westminster style. All right. What we have, therefore, is that this suspension of the lower house by executive seats under 150 has given rise to disquiet among many sectors. And my own practice as a corporate lawyer, even business industrialists are withholding their investments in relationship to whether or not the emergency would continue and about the political uncertainty that surrounds it. Obviously, there are some businessmen who say, oh, I enjoy this very stability and no more political squabbles. But I think that is a short-sighted view. The sovereign will of the people is expressed through Parliament, and the wisdom of His Majesty in recognizing that is something that all concerned citizenry would welcome. And I think it beholds, with greatest respect to Yang Mat Mohamad Prime Minister and the Cabinet, to listen to that advice and not to negate the calling of Parliament, because laws passed through ordinance does not have the legal and moral legitimacy as an expression of the sovereign will of the people. That's an important point to note. And perhaps the third commentator, a political commentator, may expand on that statement.
Okay, Philip, we will ask him. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We really do appreciate you sharing those insights. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We will be back with more on this topic. Stay tuned.
Agenda Awani Asia membawa anda melihat isu serantau dengan lebih dekat dan mendalam.
Tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. Awani 7.45 lebih awal dari biasa.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir 2 kali.
Notifikasi berita terkini dan navigasi mudah. Podcast dikemas kini dengan berita dan program.
Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope.
Serta video tanpa had dengan scroll tanpa henti. Buat turun aplikasi baru Astro AWANI sekarang.
Gagalan Kerajaan Persekutuan tunai janji melaksanakan projek baik pulih sekolah daif turut diulas Menteri Muda Pendidikan dan Penyelidikan Teknologi Dr. Anwar Rapai.
COVID-19, 2 lagi kes disyaki atau PUI direkodkan di Sarawak.
So hopefully kita akan mendapat kedudukan yang lebih baik di masa-masa akan datang.
Udang geragau atau bubuk dalam bahasa tempatan terkenal sebagai bahan utama dalam pembuatan belacan atau cencalo.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah
Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation as political analyst Professor Hamidin Hamid joins us now. Hamidin, what do you think the Yang di-Pertuan Agong issued this statement, that Parliament can in fact convene some 46 days after agreeing to the state of emergency? Why do you think that he did so, now?
I think, thank you, Melissa. Thank you for having me tonight. I think when Yang di-Pertuan Agong issued a statement from the palace saying that it is okay for Parliament to convene during the emergency, I think Tuan could really listen to the voice of the people who, to some extent, really want to see Parliament have their own sitting even during the emergency. In fact, throughout history, I think it is very much normal for Malaysia. Remember, we were under emergency from 1965 up to 2011, and not only the parliament's sitting is allowed, but we have a couple elections during that time. So I think it is a call by Yang di-Pertuan Agong, definitely. But at the end of the day, for Parliament to convene, is still Yang di-Pertuan Agong need to act based on the advice of the Prime Minister. So I think it's given tremendous pressure for Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin to call for Parliament.
But what do you think, Hamidin, what do you think will be the resistance on the part of the current administration? We know that at the point at which the emergency was called, the legitimacy of the government was in question. There were a number of UMNO MPs who had withdrawn their support. And so the suspicion, whether based on fact or just by the sheer coincidence of those events, suggested that the emergency might have had a much more personal or private reasons rather than a public good. Do you think that changes anything? Has that situation or that context in fact changed?
No, I don't think so, Sharaad. I think when look at the situation here, I think when we're talking about the current situations of emergency, even the call for emergency, government give a reason that it is for the COVID, but for most of the people, it is about politics. It is, as mentioned just now, because of the current political situation where it looks like Muhyiddin government is losing their numbers, losing the confidence of the majority of the members of the parliament. However, I have to emphasize here that emergency give big advantage to Tan Sri Muhyiddin, in my point of view. So even though one of the biggest things that he has to consider when he called for parliament, if he want to call for the parliament, I think it's not about the vote of no confidence. I think government will take care of that as usual, putting the government business at first. But I think if UMNO, for example, especially member of Parliament of UMNO, one by one, make it official that they are no longer in support, I think politically that will give a big trouble for Tan Sri Muhyiddin. However, the government is still standing, in my point of view, because of the emergency. So he still can rule, and then he can form the cabinet, emergency cabinet. However, politically, he is cornered to call for the election, which I don't think he wants to do.
Can I ask you? You said that if he wants to call for a reconvene parliament, is that an option? I mean, there's been an advisory statement from the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. Does the Prime Minister have the option
definitely.
of if?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is. If you look at the constitution, politically also, but the Yang di-Pertuan Agong can only call for the parliament to sit under the advice of the Prime Minister. Until and when Prime Minister give her advice, Parliament will not be sitting. I think it's clear as that. But definitely, politically, it will be a nightmare for Tan Sri Muhyiddin not to call the Parliament. I think that is a very, as mentioned just now, when the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, or the palace issued a statement, I think that's given tremendous pressure for Tan Sri Muhyiddin to call or to give advice to call for the sitting of the Parliament. I think what he wants to do now, he wants to really to set the time, the duration, and the agenda of the Parliament sitting. I think that is the most important part in the mind of Tan Sri Muhyiddin.
Hamidin, can I ask you to clarify, is it possible that the Prime Minister could delay the sitting of Parliament until that 6-month deadline is met, when Parliament, I think it's at the end of June, if I'm not mistaken. Could he do that?
Yes, he can do that. Yes, he can do that. But politically, I think because Yang di-Pertuan Agong already called, I think that will give a tremendous pressure for him. I think that will give a big liability for him to do that. But he still can do that. He's entitled to do that. Emergency ordinance give him that leeway.
Yeah, and I think this is, of course, reflected in now a contest of opinions as with regards to whether the monarch can in fact convene parliament without the express advice of the Prime Minister. But I want to ask you this, Hamidin, about Perikatan Nasional. Why is it so weak when we know that holding the position of Prime Minister opens up resources to in fact co-opt all kinds of political forces, so that becoming a prime minister should give you much more leverage. And it's been a year since Perikatan Nasional has been in power. We've seen shifts in GLC and GLIC leadership reflecting, the current dispensation, and so on and so forth. Why hasn't Muhyiddin Yassin been able to show up support for himself? What is the base of this problem?
I think, Gerard, the basic is basically because Bersatu is not the major shareholder of the seat in the parliament. I think even within the Perikatan Nasional, I think Bersatu is basically second after UMNO. And there is no clear cooperation between the three, unless for the form of government. It's different compared to when Bersatu and during the Pakatan Harapan, because there is a clear agreement in terms of that. But for Perikatan Nasional, I think it's just the support of Muhyiddin as a Prime Minister. To what extent we support his government, that will be another question. So, in my point of view, the failure of Tan Sri Muhyiddin is failure to tame UMNO, in my point of view. This is the big failure that they have to deal with.
And what do you understand to be the current situation in UMNO? There are so many rumors flying around about the different factions and whether there is, consensus to continue this cooperation with Perikatan Nasional. What are you hearing?
I think, for me, the way I see it is this is the advantage of emergency for Tan Sri Muhyiddin, where he can prolong the frictions within UMNO. And in my point of view, because of that, now we can hear the contestation within UMNO, some who want to stay with the Perikatan Nasional, some who want to call for the elections. And in my point of view, this is the thing that Tan Sri Muhyiddin really want to look at. And I think he want to really much secure some section of UMNO to support of him and also to secure pass. So with that, I think Bersatu will have a much clearer faction, bigger number when it comes to the general election.
One of the things, of course, with the state of emergency is the suspicion that this is also time to make preparations for that much anticipated next general election. But what would have to go into the compact between those parties that now constitute Perikatan Nasional in order to make the general election decisive in the interests of Muhyiddin Yassin and his political party and those who follow him?
I think for Perikatan Nasional, especially for Tan Sri Muhyiddin, the emergency gives them a very much a leeway to how to deal with the most of the opposition. Look at this. Look at the UMNO situation. UMNO cannot hold their general election, and this is the highest ranking decision making with UMNO. Whatever decision that normally UMNO will do is by the General Assembly. That they are supposed to do sometime next month. So with that, and the prolonged give much more breathing space, in my point of view, for Tan Sri Muhyiddin to make Bersatu become more established in terms of numbers, in terms of the seat, and in terms of the position for Bersatu to deal with. I think this is the thing that Tan Sri Muhyiddin will continuously use for the advantage of Bersatu.
Hamidin, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for helping us put this all into perspective. We appreciate your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. Don't forget to get all your latest news and COVID-19 vaccine updates on astroawani.com and the Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Have a great weekend and good night.